Greetings, salutations, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you are, wherever we are meeting you. Thank you so much for joining us on Generational Archives. I'm Dr. Raina J. León, and I am here with Dr. Norma D. Thomas. Mommy, how are you going to introduce yourself today?
Well, you say, I always say that I'm happy to be here, but I am happy to be here. So that's how I'm going to introduce myself today.
Excellent. And I am also happy to be here and share this time with you, Mommy, and share this time with you, listeners. So if you are new to the podcast, this is the show where we connect, heal, uncover through intergenerational conversations and archival research. What that means is we generally focus on one member of our family and talk about how we have used records and interviews and documents, how we have discovered more about them, and so how we have discovered more about ourselves. And, you know, we're kind of funny, we're cool people, and we like to hang out together. Me and my mom, we have been collaborating on projects, I like to tell people, since I was born. Why not? Why not claim like decades of interconnection and building together? But definitely since I was a child. So today we're going to be focusing on my great-grandmother, your grandmother, and we'll give all the details and her name and get into the records that we have to share with you as hopefully inspiration for your own journey in just a moment. But we've been starting our podcast with a check-in question. And so this time our check-in question is, what is the longest amount of time you spent away from us, Mommy, your children, before the age of 18? And how did that make you feel?
Well, I did not ever spend much time away from my children except to go to work. That's what I remember. And once you all were a little older, when I was working for the Philadelphia Corporation for Aging and started to present at conferences, then there might have been a couple of days when I would be going to a conference to present. But I was pretty adamant that I never sent you all to a camp.
Yeah.
Other people sent their kids to camp and were so happy to, quote unquote, send their kids away. And I was like, no, I'm not sending my kids to no camp. They stay home. It was rare that you all spent the night at other people's houses, and then I would have checked the house out before you ever were able to spend the night there. So I didn't spend much time away from you all when you were young.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do remember you going away to one conference, and I must have been maybe 9 or 10, and Papi trying to figure out how to do my hair, which was not a disaster, but like there was a lot of effort involved.
And I'm sure I called like quite frequently to make sure
Yes.
there were no disasters when I was away.
Well, even when you would arrive home from work, and that was just the day, I remember Tito and I just rushing to the door every day with hugs and being so happy that you had come home from the day. I also remember, I can't remember when you had told me this, but you having said, oh, I wish I had been able to be a stay-at-home mom, but it just not being a part of how our lives had worked.
Well, I always had to work, so I was back at work 2 weeks after you were born, and that was after having an emergency C-section. So I always was in the predicament, unfortunately, that I had to go right back to work. So I never got the experience of being able to stay home with my children. So I missed some milestones.
Yeah. And so for me, the longest that I have been away from my children is much longer than a day, much longer than overnight, much longer than a few days even for a conference. So the longest I think has been a week. And that's happened twice since my son was born. My son is now almost 5. And the first time was when he was a baby. I went to a silent retreat at Spirit Rock in the Bay Area. And it's a retreat where you literally have to give over your phone. If you can't give it over, like when you first sign in, they have a whole ceremony where you can give it over into a basket. And it was a week-long silent retreat. No talking, no checking in with anybody. And I remember so much guilt as I went to drive there because Fede had just gotten a cold. And my husband was like really, really anxious about this baby with a cold. And I kept telling myself as I'm going to Spirit Rock and the signal is dying out, so I can't call anyway, he will be okay. It will be just fine. It'll be just fine. And going to this retreat, which I really needed for clarification around a number of things. And then most recently, now my daughter is almost 3, my son again almost 5, and I went on a week-long tour to Texas to in celebration of my my book, Black God, Mother, This Body, with 2 other great friends of mine who also have books out at the same time, Jasmine Mendez and Yesenia Montilla. And we were going on a Texas tour. And that meant that I was going to be away for a week and feeling all sorts of anxiety around that, but in the same space of my children will be fine. They have a regular schedule with school now. Their dad can drop them off in the morning. You and Papi will pick them up in the afternoon. It'll be just fine. And they were. I talked to them every day on FaceTime, and it was delightful. And then we all went about our day. So,
well, you also forget that most recently you and your husband both were gone.
That's right.
And the children were with us, and you would call home, and your son, when I said, well, your mom's on the phone, and he gets on and he says, you have to come
That's
back
right.
home now.
He would make us maps. He would be like, you have to find the map.
You have to come home now.
Come home now. So
they survived.
They survived. And the longest that we've been away together, my husband and I, was 2 nights, I want to say. We went for a wedding. But that's definitely been the longest away from both of our children. So that question is poignant because we're going to be talking about my Nana Sarah and her experience of mothering, which is important. So thinking about her early beginnings, how old must she have been when she had grandmom and Aunt Bernice?
She got married at 15 or 16. So
Yeah.
I think she had my mother at 16. Her husband was 21. So at that time, that would have meant a pretty significant age difference.
Yeah.
And she was very, very young.
Yeah.
I want to start out by reading a letter that she wrote to my father, and then I'll put this in some context.
Yes.
So it says, Dear Eddie, my dad's name was Eddie. I just don't, which is my husband's name, actually. I just don't write much anymore. I am doing fairly well. How are you doing? Here at church Sunday, there will be flowers, 12 pink roses in memory of Esther, who was my mother. On the 4th in July, Sunday at 7, there will be memory service for all choir members who have passed on. Candle lighting for each. Close relatives will light the candle when the deceased name is called. I will light one for Esther. I thought you would like to know, how is your mother and father? My father's parents were still living at this point in 1987. Give them my love. I hear from the children, especially Norma. Love, Sarah. So my father and my grandmother had an interesting relationship. It was strained after we talk about in a previous episode that I lived with her for 2 years, and she had started planning my college education. And as soon as my dad heard that, he came and got me. And after that, the relationship was fairly strained. I can remember on occasion my dad saying, your grandmother has all this money. I don't know why he thought she had a lot of money, and all she sends you all is a fruitcake for Christmas. So we would get this fruitcake faithfully every Christmas. None of us really liked fruitcake, but that was the present we received from her every Christmas. So it's interesting that she wrote this letter to keep in touch with him. And my grandmother and I always remained close until she died. So we were actually very, very close. But her story is interesting. Again, you all have heard she did not raise my mother or my mother's sister. She, at some point after getting married, her and her husband Walter moved to Washington, D.C. I don't know when that was, but I vaguely remember that he worked for the railroad. And in the stories that we recently heard when we went to South Carolina, there had been a terrible argument. What the argument was about, I don't know. And he left. So she was there with two small babies, and she had to go to work. And my grandfather's sister, my Aunt Minnie, tells the story that she would leave the children alone so that she could go to work. And one day, Walter came back, saw his two children in the house by themselves. My aunt was young enough to be in the crib. My mother, Aunt Minnie says, was tied to the crib. I don't, who embellishes the story, I don't know. But what happened is Walter took the children to his sister in South Carolina. And when she came home, her children were gone.
Yeah.
Now, at some point, she found out where they were. My aunt always resented the fact that she did not come back to get them. And my grandmother talked as though she did not understand the resentment, because she said, well, I always bought them things, I sent money, but my aunt never forgave her for not coming to get them. My mother reconciled that because, again, we had a good relationship with my grandmother. She lived in Columbus, Ohio, not that far from us. So we saw her frequently. The aunt who raised my mother, we did not see frequently. Really at all. She would call and get very upset that we would not call her grandmother. But we had our grandmother in Ohio, so, it would always be confusing, these two women who were our grandmother, but one was actually our grandmother, one was actually our aunt. So that was the relationship. I had a relationship with her all my life. I lived with her for a time. She was a nurse. I don't know if she was an RN or an LPN. She did a lot of private duty, worked for families. She also worked in the prison. So she did nursing in the prison. So I always found that very fascinating, that she would go into prisons. And because she was a nurse, I wanted to be a nurse.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes, until I was a junior in high school, maybe up to being a senior in high school. And there was some program where the Uniontown Hospital was recruiting people to be phlebotomists.
I do remember this story.
Going into phlebotomy. So a group of us go to the hospital. I realized that, wait a minute, if I'm a nurse, I have to deal with blood and bodily fluid. I don't want to be no nurse. And so I switched that career, and eventually my career, although everybody thought I would be a journalist, that's the career everybody thought I would go into, I went into social work. But my sister became the nurse.
That's right.
We did have a nurse in the family, but that was my grandmother, who was, again, raised in the country. So my grandmother could... And she did, and I was there when she did it, when they lived in Ohio, cut the head off of a chicken, and the chicken goes running down the driveway. And she came to Uniontown once and went out in the woods and said, oh, there's all this natural stuff up here. You all could cook and eat. Now, my grandmother couldn't cook, so clearly when she picked all this stuff out of the woods, we didn't eat that stuff because she wasn't the best cook. But she had that country upbringing. And her and the only grandfather I knew, because I didn't know my biological grandfather at all, never met him. I knew her husband, who was Willard Croston. So she was Sarah Logan Croston. And while I lived with them, they were married, and they got divorced while I lived with them because he would drink a little too much. And so at some point they got divorced, but they remarried and left Ohio, went back to Saluda. When he died and when she died, they were living in Saluda, South Carolina. So my grandmother had a very interesting history, very interesting marriage story. But one thing, at least with her documents, the birth date is correct on everything. It's consistent. And her parents are consistent. Her parents were Marshall Logan and Eliza Hill. And Marshall is the son of Harry Logan, who we've talked about before. So her grandfather was Harry Logan. Do you remember much about Nana Sarah?
Yeah, I do. I remember how like caring she was. I also remember that as a child she bought me a ruby ring. And it was something that you treasured so much. I loved that she had bought me this ruby ring, and you would be the one who's like, don't touch this ring, you're going to lose this ring. And I had in our old house in Southwest Philly a little turtle that I would keep like my most precious things in. And I kept that there for a while, but then you would start to find like, oh, that's where that, this ring disappeared, and that's where
Raina
this
would pick up keys and other things and put in that little turtle.
Well, and then so you kept finding where I was keeping my treasures, and so I determined that I needed to keep some treasures in a different space, and I think I put that ring in like a crevice of my closet.
Oh no.
And never found it again. And so every now and then I think about this ruby ring that my great grandmother had bought for me out of love for me as well as love for you. And considering the stories of how much supposed wealth she had and the fruitcake, how much of a gift and a stretch that must have been for her to buy for a little kid a ruby ring, and having lost it. So you were right. I lost the ruby ring.
And she was there for talking about birth stories.
That's right.
When you were born, she came because right after you were born, I had to be hospitalized, and I wouldn't go to the hospital until she got there. And she stayed until I came out of the hospital. She stayed for a few weeks, and I was so sad to see her leave because she was there supporting. And then when my son was born, she came right before he was scheduled to be born, but they delayed the cesarean. So she stayed those additional 3 weeks and then stayed after he was born as well. So it was really wonderful to have someone who knew what they were doing with these babies to be supportive.
And looking at the pictures that I have that you gave me of being a baby, is seeing those pictures of her holding me, of Aunt Faith holding me, of Grandmom holding me. And so having all of these women within our family to be a part of this birth story, especially one that was pretty traumatic for you, and I'm supposing for baby me, being separated from you for, what was it, a week?
Well, and in fact, you talk about separation. When I wound up having to go back to the hospital, it was 10 days in the hospital with me crying all 10 days in isolation in the hospital with a staph infection from the hospital and just crying the whole time. That's what my husband always talks about, me just crying the whole time.
Yep. And at the same time, on the other side, the care that must have been lavished upon me as an infant, with all of these women around, and them themselves, like two of them being nurses, and Grandmom having worked in a hospital herself.
Yes, your grandmother, when she went back to work, she didn't work when we were young. She went back to work at 13, when I was 13 or 14. I wrote when I was 14, but for some reason, I really remember 13 being this defining age that now Norma can take care of the family while I go to work. And she worked as a nurse's aide at nighttime at the hospital.
So that, I think, that knowledge of three women who had healthcare connections, experience, expertise, and seeing you, become sicker and sicker, and knowing that something is wrong, I think that helped to save both of our lives, actually.
And I had said to Raina, I wasn't sure I would talk about her diagnosis when she died, because you never know, even these days, how people respond to the diagnosis of someone having AIDS, because that's what she died from.
Yes.
But my grandfather, as I said at one point, did indulge too much in alcohol. But he got his act together and said to me at the end of his life he wished he had not drank so much during his life because he wound up being a kidney dialysis patient. So when she received the diagnosis, this was before they knew what this disease really was,
Right.
and before they were really screening the blood supply really well. So I will give credit for her being back in South Carolina and the Bible Belt, that my family was able to find somebody who would take care of her, who would be at the house. She had told me for a while that she was losing weight, and she thought that was a good thing because the doctor took her off her diabetic medication, and so this was seen as this really positive thing. And then we find out why she was losing weight. And in fact, her death certificate, AIDS is not always written on death certificates. At least it wasn't. But hers does say acquired immune deficiency syndrome. And the first diagnosis was meningitis, which would be connected to the diagnosis. So she only lived 2 months after the diagnosis.
Yeah.
It was very, very fast, very, very quick. One of my uncle's wives showed up at the house and saw how much weight she had really lost. And that's when everyone got alarmed, and she wound up in the hospital. And the discussion became, how did she get this disease? I can remember everybody saying, how, and then me saying, why does it even matter?
Right.
Why? Who cares? I mean, she wasn't an IV drug user. I mean, but, in the end, who cares why she got this disease? This disease is going to kill her because, of course, there was no drugs then for people to live with a chronic illness. Now it was a death sentence. So she was not here very long after. And one of the things about my grandmother, I had a copy of her will, and her will left all her possessions to me and my sister Carla. That's what was in the will. I don't know if she made a subsequent will. My mother had died before she died, and so in the will, she only left my Aunt Bernice $2. So that says something about their relationship, that she left her something, but it was $2. And I always said, oh my gosh, when she dies, this is going to be horrible. Well, again, I don't know if there was a subsequent will. Her brother was the executor. He was the executor on the will that I had. And what he did, again, maybe it was in the will, maybe not. But if it wasn't in a subsequent will, what he did was divide all her assets, or at least the cash from the assets, among all her grandchildren. And because my Aunt Bernice had 7, there were all of us, 7. And so between her 14 grandkids and her surviving daughter, who also received the trailer that she was living in at the time that was on her brother's property. So he divided everything up among her surviving heirs, and that was the way to do it.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping it was the subsequent will that said that, but if not, I'm very grateful for my great uncle Harry, because that's what he did. And so there was no contention when she died, as there should not be when somebody passes along.
I think that's a good thing to raise to folks as they are considering making their own wills of, are you going to leave your people drama, or are you going to leave them a way to celebrate you and be in good relationship to one another? So as my husband and I are in this space of starting to think about wills and trusts and living wills and all these things, which we should have talked about a long time ago. I know we got babies. Anybody's got babies, you should have a will. We know. We're working on it. But what are you going to leave to your people? Are you going to leave them drama? And whether it was actually in the will or not, I give a lot of credit to that uncle who was like, we don't need no drama. So let's do a different plan than what was in this one will.
Yeah, it's a side issue, but it's a big issue to have these discussions, because of that will that I had been enforced, and I had the will, so I could have said, this is the will, I could have caused drama because this is what this will said. But the way it was done in the end, made total sense to
Yeah.
me. Something I just looked at as part of the story when I came back to Uniontown, Pennsylvania with my family. One of the things my grandmother made my mother promise is that she would continue my piano lessons.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
And that's another benefit I had with living with my grandmother, that I had piano lessons. And so my mother, even though it would have been very difficult to do, and even though the lessons were $1 a week, I don't remember them ever being more than that, even when we transferred different teachers, that I played that piano until I was a junior in high school, and finally said to my mother, I hate this. And sometimes, Mom, I actually go to the place where I'm supposed to have lessons and I keep walking because I haven't practiced. They managed to find some very, very old piano that they put in the basement where some of the keys didn't work. Because
I think that piano was there when I was.
Probably.
Yeah.
It was damp in the basement, so it wasn't the best place for a piano. But somehow, to keep that promise to my grandmother, they got a piano, and I took lessons until one day I said to my mother, "You were so wasting your money."
And that was a regret for you.
It was a regret.
Yeah.
And then at some point, Raina arranged for me to get piano lessons because I said, so I always had the gift of being able to read music because of those piano lessons. And now I've been taking piano lessons again for several years.
Yeah.
And that was a gift that my grandmother gave me that as a child I did not appreciate, but as an older adult now, I've gone back to playing the piano.
Look at that. All these women in your life, your grandmother, your mother, and then later when you decide that was one of your goals for retirement, your daughter helps you out a little bit with that one. Because your goals in retirement were to play the piano, to learn Spanish, and there was another one. What was the third one?
One,
to be published as a poet, to work on
to start writing again.
Yeah,
because I'd already taken off the bucket list at least getting to the continent.
Yes.
Once, and so
you did that when you retired with me.
I've been to Kenya and I had been to Egypt. So
right, that's right.
We were over there. So that one I've taken off the bucket list. So my bucket list is real small.
Right, and like we chipped in, me, my husband, my brother,
and got me a piano.
And got you a piano. You chipped in for yourself too, because you got a bigger piano. And I found you that teacher in Western Pennsylvania that you worked with for a while, and I tell people all the time that you're a pianist now, because
I'm not a pianist. I play the piano.
I try to convince you
I plunk at the piano. But I enjoy it because it is truly a legacy from my grandmother that I did go back to and fulfill that promise that she wanted kept, that at least I would do that one thing when I left her and went back to Uniontown.
Oh.
So my grandmother was a wonderful woman. She was supportive all my life, and her and my mother had that very good relationship, even though she did not raise my mother. And it speaks to reconciliation. It speaks to forgiveness. My aunt never did forgive her, and as a consequence, her children did not have a close relationship with their biological grandmother, but we did, and I'm very, very grateful for that.
One, I offered to those who are listening the question of how are you honoring the promises that you may have made to your ancestors? So in this case, it's a piano, but are there other promises that you might want to revisit? And thinking about the closeness of relationships too. When we went down to South Carolina, remember we were talking to Logan at the Logan Funeral Home, who is a cousin of ours, we discovered, and talking to other cousins, and they had no idea that Nana Sarah even had children, because of that disconnect from mother to the daughters that she did not raise. And so yet in other documents, a document from the family reunion, our our aunt and in my case grandmom were listed, but how they were listed, how they were known. There were family members who had no idea that they had cousins. One who never left the South Carolina area was there in Columbia for most of her life. So and my grandmom in Pennsylvania, of course, but she was in South Carolina too until she was, early 20s or so. So, but having no relationship with those cousins, for example, they didn't even know she existed.
So again, this is the path of our exploration. For my part of the podcast, we've kind of been going back. I have this systematic way of thinking about things. So in terms of process, going back one step at a time, there'll be a point at which we can't get back,
Yes.
but we haven't reached there yet. I know when my husband looked at the picture of Harry Logan, the first thing he said, he's directly from Africa. And I said, why do you say that? And he said, no, he's directly from Africa. And again, if you listen to the story, he says he was sold from a soapbox in Massachusetts. So we'll see. Maybe we'll get back to his origin story and be able to make some clarification. So we keep going back, and the episode before this one, we started with my husband's family, my daughter's grandmother. So we will be continuing on those stories.
Yep. And I think that as we inquire more and more, not I think, I know, more and more information comes, and perhaps you too will have a similar experience as you are holding questions and continuing to dig, that doors start to open and you start to get more information. That definitely came through when we were in South Carolina last, and found that that family reunion document where many of our family members were listed there from a family reunion program from the 90s that had all of these lines and their children and prayers that were said in the family and little bits of family history. So that being a surprise at the top of a trunk. Soon we will be going to South Carolina again, and once you hear this recording, it will be perhaps several weeks after our trip to South Carolina. We are intending to go to at the Lockhart Baptist Church to go to Easter service, because if we can find out anything, if we can connect with folks from the community, it will probably be at Easter service. So continue to listen and we'll share what we learn. And thank you so much for going on the journey with us, and we wish you well in yours. Mommy, are there any closing remarks for folks?
Just like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you see us on YouTube, and again, during April and May, we have this contest. We're trying to get more subscribers, so please let us know that you have subscribed. Send an email to StoryJoy Inc., STORY JOYINC@gmail.com, and we'll answer your questions, and you might win a prize.
Excellent. So talk to you next time, and I hope that you will be listening next time. Again, like and subscribe and share the news with others, and we hope that your way is guided well.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.